This is the 5-Minute Leadership Podcast, where we help leaders solve their leadership problems. Today we have my good friend, Pastor Dennis Sy, who's going to talk about how to multiply like leaders. Dennis, thanks for taking the time here.
Good day, Pastor Steve.
Dennis has been with Victory for many, many years as a youth pastor and many different roles of ministry, and now is the senior pastor of Victory Green Hills, a thriving, growing congregation here in Metro Manila. And Dennis, if churches are shrinking, then we have a leadership surplus. But when a church is growing rapidly, like where you're leading, then there's a leadership shortage. How do you approach the leadership shortage?
Our church was growing. We started with 400 people, and it jumped to 1,000 in a year. The services were doing fine, but our discipleship groups were not doing well.
We had always emphasized discipleship and leadership development, but we started making disciples as a much more prominent part of that and pretty much stopped talking about leadership development.
That was one thing we were fighting for before. We thought if we get healthy disciples, leadership development will follow. But it did not.
It didn't.
We just had healthy disciples who weren't leading well.
And stressed leaders.
Yes, and stressed leaders.
Overworked leaders, yeah.
Yeah, we had no leadership pipeline. If you would ask us before who would replace me if something happens, I won't have any answers. We had a lot of disciples, but we had few leaders.
What have we done since then to correct it?
One thing that I've noticed is language is so important. So when you started talking about discipleship, everybody was sold out. And so when we removed the leadership term and the leadership development term, it's like what you don't see, you won't think about.
And to be clear, we didn't devalue leadership. We just had a false assumption that if we make disciples, leaders will happen organically.
Yes.
And they didn't.
When we started bringing back again in the forefront of our role as pastors to develop leaders, that's when we started making it a rally cry again. Yeah. We need more people in our leadership pipeline. We need more Victory Group leaders who would really lead and not just do Bible studies or facilitate groups.
You're right, language does matter. I know there's a whole idea of all these things that happen organically, but I don't really see that happening a lot, because it sure didn't in that case. It had to be intentionally taught and preached and modeled and lived by example. That intentionality usually creates something that looks organic, but it rarely is.
Leadership takes time. It's very messy. So if it's all organic and there's no schedule for, I need to develop this guy as a leader, it will not happen. Being deliberate about it and saying, I need to meet with this guy, I'm eyeing him, I'm giving him roles and responsibilities to make him a better leader, that needs to be in the forefront of a pastor's mind.
Dennis, when we talk about multiplying leaders, so often they don't look like leaders. How do we find the next Dennis Sy? When you think we've got to multiply leaders, what are you looking for?
I had to remind myself, this is where I came from. And so now I look at somebody and it seems like there's no leadership potential. I had to remind myself, that was me years ago. And I need to be more deliberate and intentional about developing him. We have these 5 things that we filter through. We call it faith. Faithful, available, involved, teachable, and hungry. You look at that and you see and you say, is this guy faithful? Does he show up? Is he faithful in the word? Is he faithful in wanting to be developed as a leader and as a disciple of Christ? Is he available? Involved, which means they're doing the work already, not I'm picking you up because you seem like a flashy leader and I can develop you, but it's really more of you're doing the job already and you're doing the dirty work. And so now let's put you on to another level of leadership. Of course, teachability and being hungry.
Speaking of being hungry, I've got a book here. I love this book, Act Like a Man. It's gone all over the nation, and you've got a website, a blog, one of the more popular blogs in the Philippines about manhood. Why do you feel compelled to talk about, preach about, tweet about, write everything about manhood?
I think it's tied up with leadership development. When I started pastoring the church in Green Hills, we were attracting a lot of 18 to 35 years old. Because I was 27 at the time when we planted. When we were seeing all these single men coming into church, most of them were fatherless. Most of them, nobody believed in them when they were young. And so when I saw just the great need for men to be coached, mentored, and fathered, we started doing blogs on manhood, because we know if men would experience God, there would be growth in church.
Dennis, thanks for the time. Thanks for the way you lead. And seriously, thanks for the way you act like a man and that you model manhood, servant leadership. Remember, every aspect of leadership comes back to the heart, comes back to a skill. And so there's a heart to multiply. That's the opposite of a controlling, non-empowering leader. And there are also skills, though, and that's what Dennis has talked about a little bit. There are some skills we have to have in terms of training other leaders so that we can multiply and solve our leadership shortages.
We call it faith.
Yeah.
Faithful, available, involved, intense.
you're
I
trying to
was
spell it.
going to say intense.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.